Gideon stepped out of the black Bentley, his designer suit catching the afternoon light as he stared at the same front door that had slammed shut behind him 12 years ago. But this time, he wasn't the broken 17-year-old they'd thrown away. My beautiful family and friends, welcome back. If you're ready for another unforgettable story, do me a quick favor, hit that like button. Why? Because every like tells YouTube, this story is worth sharing with more people who might really need it today. Drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from. I do read every single one, and it makes me feel like we're sitting together in the same room, sharing these moments heart to heart. And don't forget to share this video with someone you love. You never know, the story you share might be the encouragement they've been praying for. This isn't just a channel, it's a family. And when you engage, you're helping us build a safe space where real stories bring real hope. Now, take a deep breath. Get comfortable, and let's dive into today's story. The Georgia heat pressed against Gideon's skin like a suffocating memory as he adjusted his platinum Rolex, a watch worth more than his parents had made in 3 years back when they'd called this place home. The familiar creak of the old oak tree in the front yard sent shivers down his spine, its branches still reaching toward the same bedroom window where he'd once sobbed into his pillow, dreaming of escape. "Are you ready for this, baby?" The gentle voice belonged to Eleanor, his 72-year-old companion who stepped gracefully from the passenger side. Her silver hair was perfectly coiffed, her pearl necklace catching the sunlight, but her eyes held the fierce protectiveness of a lioness. She wasn't just his nanny, she was the woman who'd saved his life when his own flesh and blood had thrown him away like garbage. Gideon's jaw tightened as he noticed the peeling paint on the house's shutters, the overgrown weeds choking what used to be his mother's prized rose garden. 12 years ago, this modest 2-story home in Macon had felt like a prison. Now, standing here worth more money than anyone in this neighborhood could fathom, it looked pathetically small. "I've been ready for this moment since the day they told me I was an abomination," he whispered, his voice carrying the weight of every sleepless night, every tear, every moment of rage that had fueled his climb from rock bottom to the pinnacle of success. The front door was the same faded blue his father had painted it the summer before everything fell apart. The summer before Gideon had found the courage to tell his parents the truth about who he loved. The summer before their good Christian household had imploded with hatred so venomous it had nearly killed him. Eleanor placed her weathered hand on his arm, her touch still carrying the same comfort it had when she'd found him that horrific night, beaten and bloodied, thrown out like trash on the streets of Atlanta. "Remember what we discussed. Sometimes the most powerful revenge is success mixed with mercy." But mercy wasn't what burned in Gideon's chest as he noticed the rusted mailbox that still bore the family name, Thompson. The same name they'd screamed at him to never use again. The same name he'd legally changed, vowing to build his empire under his chosen identity while they rotted in their small-minded world. A movement in the front window caught his attention, a shadow pulling back quickly, as if someone had been watching. His mother, perhaps. Or his father. Did they recognize the man who'd once been their disappointing son? Could they see past the expensive clothes, the confident posture, the unmistakable aura of wealth and power? The neighborhood hadn't changed much. Same chain-link fences, same beat-up cars, same narrow minds hiding behind drawn curtains. But everything felt different now because he was different. The scared, desperate boy who'd left this place broken and homeless had returned as someone they couldn't touch, couldn't hurt, couldn't destroy. "The lawyers confirmed everything?" he asked Eleanor, though he already knew the answer. She nodded, a knowing smile playing at her lips. "Every document is in order. The house, the debts, the medical bills, everything is exactly as we discussed. They have no idea what's coming." Gideon's phone buzzed with a text from his assistant. "The news crews will be here in 20 minutes. Are you sure about this?" He typed back without hesitation, "Absolutely." As he slipped the phone into his jacket pocket, his fingers brushed against the folded letter he'd carried for 12 years, the last cruel words his parents had ever spoken to him, written in his mother's handwriting. "You're dead to us. Don't ever come back." Well, he was back. And he wasn't dead. Not even close. The front door suddenly swung open, and there she stood, his mother, Sandra Thompson. 12 years had aged her dramatically. Her once vibrant brown hair was now streaked with premature gray, deep lines etched around her eyes. Her shoulders curved under the weight of whatever hardships had befallen the family since his departure. She looked fragile, vulnerable, nothing like the woman who'd screamed biblical verses at him while his father threw his belongings into the street. Their eyes met across the distance, and for a moment, time suspended itself between them. Recognition flickered in her gaze, followed quickly by shock, fear, and something else, something that looked dangerously close to hope. "What do you think Gideon's parents are feeling right now, seeing their son return as a wealthy, successful man? What could be so shocking that he's planned for this moment?" But Gideon wasn't the same person who'd once craved their acceptance. He was something far more dangerous now, a man with unlimited resources, unshakable confidence, and a plan 12 years in the making. The real shock was about to begin. Sandra Thompson's trembling hand clutched the doorframe as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. Behind her, Gideon caught a glimpse of the living room he remembered, the same worn burgundy couch where his father used to watch football, the same family photos lining the mantel. But conspicuously absent were any pictures of him. Gideon. His name fell from her lips like a prayer she'd forgotten how to say. "Hello, Mother." The word felt foreign on his tongue, weighted with years of pain he'd spent a fortune in therapy learning to process. "You look tired." It wasn't meant to be cruel, but the truth often cut deeper than insults. Sandra's face crumpled slightly before she caught herself, straightening with the same stubborn pride that had made her choose her religion over her son all those years ago. "What are you doing here?" The question came out as barely a whisper. Eleanor stepped forward, her presence commanding despite her gentle demeanor. "Mrs. Thompson, I'm Eleanor Whitfield. I've been taking care of your son since the night you threw him out." Her voice carried no judgment, but the weight of that statement hung heavy in the humid air. Gideon remembered that night with crystal clarity, how Eleanor had found him 3 days later, half dead from hunger and exposure, sleeping behind a dumpster in downtown Atlanta. She'd been leaving her job at the children's hospital when she'd spotted him, and something in his hollow eyes had called to the maternal instinct she'd never been able to fulfill with children of her own. "I don't understand," Sandra stammered, her gaze flickering between Gideon's obvious wealth and Eleanor's dignified presence. You're successful now?" A bitter laugh escaped Gideon's throat. "Successful is putting it mildly." He gestured toward the Bentley, knowing she could see the 2 additional black SUVs parked strategically around the block. "I own the 3rd largest tech consulting firm in the Southeast. My company's worth about $47 million, last I checked." The number hit Sandra like a physical blow. Her face went pale, and she gripped the doorframe tighter. "But more importantly," Eleanor interjected smoothly, "he's a good man. The kind of son any mother should be proud of." The words were surgical in their precision, cutting straight to the heart of Sandra's deepest regret. Gideon watched his mother's composure crumble as the full weight of what she'd lost, what she'd thrown away, began to sink in. "Raymond." Sandra's voice cracked as she called into the house. "Raymond, you need to come here." Heavy footsteps thundered down the hallway, and Gideon's chest tightened despite himself. His father appeared in the doorway, and the years had not been kind to Raymond Thompson either. The man who'd once seemed larger than life, whose approval Gideon had desperately craved, now looked diminished. His hair had gone completely gray, his once broad shoulders stooped with defeat, and his clothes hung loosely on a frame that had clearly lost significant weight. But it was his father's eyes that shocked Gideon most. Where once burned the fire of righteous anger and unwavering certainty, now there was only exhaustion. The kind of bone-deep weariness that comes from fighting battles you can never win. "Jesus Christ," Raymond breathed, the profanity slipping out before he could catch it, something that would have earned Gideon a backhand across the face in the old days. "Gideon." "Hello, Dad." The silence stretched between them like a chasm 12 years wide. Gideon found himself studying his father's face, searching for any sign of the man who'd once taught him to throw a football, who'd helped him with math homework, who'd been his hero right up until the moment Gideon had trusted him with the truth. You've done well for yourself," Raymond said finally, his voice hoarse. "No thanks to you." The words came out sharper than Gideon had intended, but he wasn't here to spare their feelings. Eleanor squeezed his arm gently, a reminder of their conversation during the drive from Atlanta. "Hatred is like acid, baby," she told him. "It destroys the container it's stored in more than anything it's poured on. But that doesn't mean we can't hold people accountable for their actions." "Why are you here, son?" Raymond asked, and the casual use of that word, son, after 12 years of silence made Gideon's jaw clench. "I'm here because this family has some unfinished business." Gideon reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick manila envelope. "And because Eleanor taught me that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is face your past head-on." Sandra's eyes widened as she stared at the envelope. "What is that?" "Your salvation," Gideon said simply. "Or your destruction. That depends entirely on what you do next." A car door slammed in the distance, followed by another. The news crews were arriving early. Gideon's phone buzzed with a text from his assistant. Channel 3, Fox 24, and the Atlanta Journal-Constitution are all here. CNN is 5 minutes out. Eleanor checked her own phone and nodded to Gideon. "It's time." "Time for what?" Sandra's voice rose in panic. "Gideon, what's happening?" But before he could answer, a news van rounded the corner, followed by another and another. Within minutes, the quiet neighborhood street was transformed into a media circus, cameras and reporters spilling out onto the cracked sidewalks. "Oh my God," Raymond whispered, his face going ashen. "What have you done?" Gideon looked at his parents, these two people who'd created him, raised him, loved him, and then destroyed him with such thoroughness that he'd nearly died from the aftermath. Now they stood before him, broken and afraid, while he held all the power. The scared 17-year-old boy in him wanted to run. The successful 30-year-old businessman wanted revenge. But the man Eleanor had helped him become, the man who'd built an empire from nothing, who'd created jobs for hundreds of people, who donated millions to LGBTQ+ youth organizations, that man wanted something far more complex. He wanted justice. He wanted healing. And he wanted the world to see exactly what rejection and hatred could cost a family. What do you think is in that envelope? And how do you think Gideon's parents are feeling seeing their successful son surrounded by news crews? "What I've done," Gideon said, his voice steady as reporters began setting up their equipment, "is return home to settle a debt. The question is whether you're ready to pay it." The first reporter was already walking up the driveway, microphone in hand, camera crew in tow. There was no turning back now. The real story was about to begin. Sandra's eyes widened as she stared at the envelope. "What is that?" "Your salvation," Gideon said simply. "Or your destruction. That depends entirely on what you do next." A car door slammed in the distance, followed by another. The news crews were arriving early. Gideon's phone buzzed with a text from his assistant. Channel 3, Fox 24, and the Atlanta Journal-Constitution are all here. CNN is 5 minutes out. Eleanor checked her own phone and nodded to Gideon. "It's time." "Time for what?" Sandra's voice rose in panic. "Gideon, what's happening?" But before he could answer, a news van rounded the corner, followed by another and another. Within minutes, the quiet neighborhood street was transformed into a media circus, cameras and reporters spilling out onto the cracked sidewalks. "Oh my God," Raymond whispered, his face going ashen. "What have you done?" Gideon looked at his parents, these two people who'd created him, raised him, loved him, and then destroyed him with such thoroughness that he'd nearly died from the aftermath. Now they stood before him, broken and afraid, while he held all the power. The scared 17-year-old boy in him wanted to run. The successful 30-year-old businessman wanted revenge. But the man Eleanor had helped him become, the man who'd built an empire from nothing, who'd created jobs for hundreds of people, who'd donated millions to LGBTQ+ youth organizations, that man wanted something far more complex. He wanted justice. He wanted healing. And he wanted the world to see exactly what rejection and hatred could cost a family. What do you think is in that envelope? And how do you think Gideon's parents are feeling seeing their successful son surrounded by news crews? "What I've done," Gideon said, his voice steady as reporters began setting up their equipment, "is return home to settle a debt. The question is whether you're ready to pay it." The first reporter was already walking up the driveway, microphone in hand, camera crew in tow. There was no turning back now. The real story was about to begin. "The bank was going to seize this property next month," Gideon continued. "Throw you out on the street with nothing but the clothes on your backs. Sound familiar?" The irony wasn't lost on anyone present. Several reporters were frantically scribbling notes, others speaking rapidly into their microphones for live broadcasts. "But I bought your debt," Gideon announced, holding up the final document. "All of it. The house, the medical bills, the credit cards, everything. As of yesterday afternoon, I own every cent you owe." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the reporters seemed stunned by the revelation. "Which means," Gideon said, his voice growing stronger with each word, "I own this house. I own your future. Just like you once owned mine." Sandra looked up at him through her tears, and for the first time, he saw not the judgmental woman who'd rejected him, but a broken mother who was beginning to understand the magnitude of what she'd lost. "What are you going to do?" she whispered. Gideon looked at the cameras, at the reporters, at the neighbors who'd once turned their backs on a desperate teenager, and then back at his parents, the people who'd given him life and then tried to take it away. "I'm going to do something you never did for me," he said, his voice carrying across the entire neighborhood. "I'm going to give you a choice." What choice do you think Gideon is about to offer his parents? Can love and forgiveness coexist with justice and accountability? Eleanor reached into her purse and pulled out a second envelope, this one sealed with official legal ribbons. The kind of document that changes lives forever. "The question is," Gideon said as the cameras rolled and the world watched, "are you finally ready to choose love over hatred?" The choice that would define not just his family's future, but serve as an example to every parent facing the same crossroads, was about to be revealed. And it would shock everyone. The weight of Gideon's words hung in the air like thunder before a storm. Sandra wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, smearing mascara she'd probably put on that morning with no idea her world was about to implode on live television. What kind of choice? Raymond's voice was barely above a whisper, but the microphones caught every syllable. Eleanor stepped forward, the sealed envelope in her hands commanding everyone's attention. "Before we reveal that," she said with a measured tone of someone who'd spent decades working with traumatized children, "I think it's important that everyone understands the full scope of what happened 12 years ago." She turned to address the cameras directly, her silver hair gleaming in the afternoon sun. "My name is Eleanor Whitfield. I was head pediatric nurse at Children's Healthcare of Atlanta for 35 years. I've seen thousands of children come through those hospital doors, but I've never forgotten the night I found Gideon." A hush fell over the crowd. Even the neighbors who'd been murmuring among themselves fell silent. "He was catatonic," Eleanor continued, her voice steady but filled with emotion. 17 years old, weighing maybe 90 pounds soaking wet, and so broken that he couldn't even tell me his name for the first 2 days. Sandra's knees buckled slightly, and she had to grab the porch railing for support. The cameras captured every moment of her anguish. "But what broke my heart even more," Eleanor said, "was when he finally started talking. Do you know what his biggest fear was? Not that he might die. Not that he was homeless and alone. His biggest fear was that maybe his parents were right. Maybe God really did hate him for who he was." "Stop," Raymond pleaded, his face gray as ash. "Please just stop." "No," Gideon's voice cut through his father's plea like a sword. "You don't get to ask me to stop anymore. You lost that right when you told me I was going to hell for loving someone." A reporter from Fox 24 stepped closer. "Mr. Thompson, can you tell us about the choice you're offering your parents?" Gideon looked at the sealed envelope in Eleanor's hands, then back at his parents. The moment he'd been building toward for 12 years was finally here, but seeing them broken and terrified on their own front porch brought up emotions he wasn't prepared for. "The choice is simple," he said, his voice carrying across the crowd. "In this envelope is a legal document that will forgive every cent of their debt. The house will be theirs, free and clear. The medical bills, paid in full. The credit card debt, erased." Gasps of shock rippled through the crowd. Mrs. Patterson actually stumbled backward on her porch. "My God," Sandra breathed. "Gideon, that's hundreds of thousands of dollars." $437,812, to be exact, Gideon confirmed. Plus legal fees. Raymond's face contorted with confusion and hope and terror all at once. "What's the catch?" This was the moment Gideon had rehearsed, the moment that would either heal a family or destroy it completely. But as he looked at his father, this man who'd once carried him on his shoulders, who'd taught him to ride a bike, who'd been his hero right up until the moment he'd chosen hatred over love, the words suddenly felt heavier than he'd expected. "The catch," Gideon said slowly, "is that you have to earn it." Eleanor handed him the envelope, and he broke the seal in front of everyone, pulling out a thick contract that had been months in the making. "For the next 12 months, the same amount of time I've been gone from your lives, you will work for my foundation. The Whitfield Thompson Foundation for LGBTQ+ youth." The name hit Sandra like a physical blow. She stared at the envelope, then at Eleanor, understanding dawning in her tear-filled eyes. "You named your foundation after both of us," she whispered. Eleanor nodded. Gideon insisted. He said that even in his darkest moments, the part of you that loved him unconditionally never fully died. He wanted to honor that. What would we have to do? Raymond asked, his voice shaking. You'll counsel families going through what we went through, Gideon explained. You'll share your story, the real story, with parents who are struggling to accept their LGBTQ+ children. You'll help them understand what rejection costs, not just for the children, but for the entire family. The crowd was dead silent, hanging on every word. You'll work with teenagers who've been thrown out by their families, Gideon continued. You'll see firsthand what your hatred almost did to me, and you'll help prevent other kids from going through the same hell. Sandra's face was a mask of conflicting emotions: hope, terror, shame, and something that might have been relief. And if we say no? Raymond asked. Then you say no, Gideon replied with devastating simplicity. The foreclosure proceeds. You lose the house. You declare bankruptcy. And you live with the knowledge that your pride was more important than your future. A reporter called out, "What if they agree but don't follow through?" Eleanor answered this one. The contract includes specific benchmarks and requirements. If they fail to meet them, the debt is reinstated immediately. But, Gideon added, and his voice softened for the first time since he'd stepped out of the Bentley, if they complete the full 12 months, if they genuinely commit to helping other families heal instead of hurt, then the debt disappears forever. And... He paused, looking directly into his mother's eyes. And I'll consider letting them back into my life. The words hit Sandra like lightning. She gasped, her hand flying to her chest, and for a moment it looked like she might collapse right there on the front porch. You'd forgive us, she whispered. I'd give you the chance to earn forgiveness, Gideon corrected. The same chance you never gave me. Raymond stepped forward, his weathered hands shaking as he reached toward the contract. Can we read it first? Of course. Gideon handed over the documents. But you have to decide right here, right now, in front of everyone. No going inside to discuss it privately. No sleeping on it. The same way you made me choose between your love and my truth in front of the entire family 12 years ago. The parallel wasn't lost on anyone. The reporters were frantically taking notes, understanding they were witnessing something unprecedented, a real-time reckoning between parent and child, played out on a stage that would be broadcast across the nation. As Raymond read through the contract, his face growing paler with each page, neighbors began gathering closer. Some looked curious, others disapproving. Mrs. Patterson had moved to the edge of her property line, clearly straining to hear every word. Do you think Gideon's parents will accept this offer? Could you work alongside families dealing with the same prejudice that destroyed your own relationship? This says we'd have to attend sensitivity training, Raymond said, his voice tight. Weekly, Gideon confirmed. Led by Dr. Martinez, one of the country's leading experts on religious trauma and family reconciliation. And we'd have to speak at conferences. At least 12 speaking engagements over the course of the year. Sharing your story with other parents, other churches, other communities that are grappling with acceptance. Sandra looked up from the papers, tears streaming down her face. What about our church? Our friends? They'll never understand. Then you'll find new friends, Eleanor said gently but firmly. The same way Gideon had to build an entirely new life when you threw him away. The brutal truth of that statement settled over everyone like a shroud. This wasn't just about money or houses or debts. This was about whether two people who'd chosen hatred over love could find their way back to their son before it was too late. The answer would shock everyone, including Gideon himself. Sandra clutched the contract to her chest, her whole body shaking as she stared at her son. The seconds stretched into eternity while cameras rolled and the entire neighborhood held its breath. "Before we answer," she said, her voice barely audible, "there's something you need to know. Something I should have told you years ago." Gideon's jaw tightened. "Mother, this isn't the time for. I looked for you." The words exploded from her like a confession she'd been holding back for over a decade. "After you left. After we threw you out. I looked for you every single day for 3 years." The crowd collectively gasped. Even the reporters stopped scribbling, stunned by the raw emotion in her voice. Raymond's face went white. "Sandra, don't." "No!" she screamed, whirling on her husband with fury that had been bottled up for years. "I'm done keeping your secrets. I'm done pretending we did the right thing." Eleanor stepped closer to Gideon, her hand finding his arm as his entire worldview began to crumble. "Every morning for 3 years," Sandra continued, her voice growing stronger, "I drove to Atlanta. I walked the streets, I went to shelters, I talked to social workers. I spent every penny we had trying to find you." Gideon stared at his mother, the woman he'd convinced himself had written him off completely. That's impossible. You said I was dead to you." "I lied." Sandra's voice cracked with anguish. "I had to lie because your father threatened to divorce me if I went looking for you. He said if I brought you back, he'd leave both of us with nothing." Raymond's face contorted with shame and anger. "Sandra, stop talking." "He said a divorced woman with a gay son would never survive in this town," Sandra pressed on, ignoring her husband's pleas. "That we'd lose everything, our jobs, our friends, our church. That it was better to lose one child than to destroy the whole family." The reporters were frantically taking notes, understanding they were witnessing the complete destruction of a family's carefully constructed lie. "But I kept looking anyway," Sandra whispered, her eyes locked on Gideon's. "Even when Raymond said he'd leave. Even when the church told me I was enabling sin. I kept driving to Atlanta every single day until—" She broke off, her face crumbling. "Until what?" Gideon demanded, his voice hoarse. Eleanor's grip on his arm tightened, as if she already knew what was coming. "Until the day I found you," Sandra whispered. "Outside that hospital. 3 weeks after you'd been discharged." The world seemed to stop spinning. Gideon felt like he was drowning, like all the oxygen had been sucked from his lungs. "You saw me." Sandra nodded through her tears. "You were sitting on a bench outside Children's Healthcare of Atlanta. You were so thin, so broken-looking. But you were alive, and you were clean, and you looked." She glanced at Eleanor with something that might have been gratitude. "You looked like someone was taking care of you." Eleanor's face had gone pale. "Mrs. Thompson, I watched you for 2 hours," Sandra continued, her voice barely a whisper. "I sat in my car across the street and watched my son, my baby, talking to this beautiful silver-haired woman who was treating him like he mattered." The pieces began clicking together in Gideon's mind with devastating clarity. "You knew. You knew Eleanor had found me." "I saw her take you home that day," Sandra confirmed. "I followed the car to that beautiful house in Buckhead. I sat outside for 3 hours, watching through the windows as she fed you dinner, as she tucked you into bed like you were her own child." Eleanor's composure finally cracked. Why didn't you come to the door? Why didn't you try to contact him?" Sandra's laugh was bitter and broken. "Because he looked happy for the first time in months. Because when I saw him smile at something you said, I realized that maybe the best thing I could do for my son was leave him with someone who could love him the way I'd failed to." The revelation hit Gideon like a physical blow. Everything he believed about his mother's rejection, everything that had fueled his anger and driven his success, was built on an incomplete truth. "So I went home," Sandra continued, "and I told Raymond I'd stopped looking. I let him believe I'd given up on you. But every year on your birthday, every Christmas, every major holiday, I drove back to that house just to see if you were okay." "How often?" Eleanor asked, her voice shaking. "At least once a month for the first 5 years. Then every few months after that." Sandra looked directly at Gideon. "I watched you graduate from high school from across the street. I was at your college graduation, sitting in the back where you couldn't see me. I've been to every major award ceremony your company has had." The crowd was dead silent, everyone trying to process the magnitude of what they were hearing. "I have scrapbooks," Sandra whispered. "Dozens of them. Every newspaper article about your success, every photo I could find online, every mention of your company. I've been documenting your life from a distance because I was too much of a coward to be part of it." Gideon's legs nearly gave out. Eleanor steadied him, but her own hands were shaking. "The night you won that humanitarian award last year," Sandra continued, "for your work with homeless LGBTQ+ youth, I was in the balcony. When you gave that speech about how rejection and abandonment had shaped your mission to help other kids, I cried so hard I had to leave early." Raymond finally found his voice. "Sandra, what have you done?" "What I should have done 12 years ago," she replied with steel in her voice. "I'm choosing my son over your pride." She turned back to Gideon, holding out the contract with shaking hands. "We'll do it. Whatever the requirements are, whatever you need from us, we'll do it. Not because of the money, not because of the house. Because maybe it's not too late to be the parents you deserved all along." How do you think this revelation changes everything? Can a mother's secret love from afar make up for years of public rejection? But as Sandra extended the contract toward him, Gideon stepped backward, his face a mask of conflicting emotions: rage, heartbreak, betrayal, and something else. Something that looked dangerously like hope. "You watched me," he said, his voice hollow. "For 12 years, you watched me rebuild my life, and you never once tried to contact me directly." "I was afraid." "You were selfish," Gideon cut her off. "You wanted the comfort of knowing I was okay without taking any of the risk of actually being my mother." The brutal truth of his words hit Sandra like a slap. The contract fluttered from her hands to the ground as the full weight of her choices, all of them, finally settled on her shoulders. The real reckoning was just beginning. The contract lay scattered on the cracked sidewalk, its pages fluttering in the humid Georgia breeze like the remnants of a shattered family's last hope. Gideon stared down at the legal documents that had taken months to prepare, then back at his mother's tear-streaked face. 12 years, he repeated, his voice growing louder with each word. 12 years you watched me from the shadows like I was some kind of zoo animal, and you want me to believe that was love? The cameras captured every moment as Gideon's carefully constructed composure finally cracked. The successful businessman facade fell away, revealing the wounded 17-year-old boy who'd never stopped bleeding from his parents' rejection. "Do you have any idea what those first few years were like?" he demanded, his voice carrying across the entire neighborhood. Do you know how many nights I cried myself to sleep wondering if my own parents ever thought about me? Wondering if I'd been so terrible, so unforgivable, that the people who created me could just forget I existed. Sandra reached toward him with trembling hands. Baby, I never forgot. Don't you dare call me that. Gideon's voice exploded with fury. You lost the right to call me baby when you chose him over me. He pointed an accusing finger at Raymond, who looked like he wanted to disappear into the earth. Eleanor stepped between them, her voice calm but firm. Gideon, honey, take a breath. No. He shook his head violently. I'm done taking breaths. I'm done being reasonable. Do you know what the worst part is? He looked directly at his mother, his eyes blazing with pain. The worst part isn't that you threw me out. It's that you made me believe I deserved it. The crowd of neighbors and reporters pressed closer, sensing they were witnessing a complete psychological breakdown played out in real time. For years, I believed I was broken, Gideon continued, his voice cracking. I believed there was something fundamentally wrong with me that made me unlovable. And while I was in therapy trying to convince myself I had value, you were sitting in parking lots spying on me like some kind of stalker. I was protecting you, Sandra started. From what? From having a mother who loved me. Gideon's laugh was hollow and bitter. You want to know what would have protected me? Walking up to Eleanor's front door and asking if you could be part of your son's life. Eleanor's face was ashen. Mrs. Thompson, is this true? Did you really know where he was all this time? Sandra nodded miserably. I thought if I stayed away, he could heal without me complicating things. What you thought, Gideon spat, was that you could have it both ways. You could keep your precious reputation intact while still getting the comfort of knowing I was alive. Well, congratulations. You got exactly what you wanted. Raymond finally found his voice. Son, your mother did the best she could. The best she could. Gideon whirled on his father with devastating fury. The best she could was to spy on me for over a decade instead of having the courage to actually be my parent? A reporter from CNN stepped forward. Mr. Thompson, given these revelations, are you withdrawing your offer? The question hung in the air like a death sentence. Gideon looked at the contract pages scattered on the ground, then at his parents. These two broken people who'd managed to wound him in ways he was only just beginning to understand. You know what the real tragedy is here, he said, his voice deadly quiet. It's not that you threw me out. Plenty of kids get rejected by their parents and survive. The real tragedy is that you could have been part of the most important parts of my life, and you chose to watch them from a distance instead. He pulled out his phone and scrolled to a photo, a picture of him receiving his college diploma. You were at my graduation, he said, showing the phone to the cameras so everyone could see. Sitting in the back, hiding like you were ashamed of me. But you know who was in the front row, crying with pride? Eleanor. You know who threw me a party afterward and invited all my friends? Eleanor. You know who stayed up all night when I was sick, who helped me with my first business plan, who walked me down the aisle at my commitment ceremony to David last year. Sandra's face went white. You're married? The question broke something fundamental inside Gideon. He stared at his mother, this woman who'd claimed to love him from afar, and realized she'd missed the most important day of his life entirely. You didn't know, he whispered, understanding dawning with devastating clarity. You stopped watching, didn't you? When did you stop caring enough to keep tabs on your son's life? Sandra's silence was answer enough. When? Gideon demanded, his voice rising. When did you decide I wasn't worth your secret stalking anymore? 2 years ago, she whispered so quietly the microphones barely caught it. Why? But even as he asked the question, Gideon realized he already knew the answer. Because Raymond got sick, Eleanor said softly, putting the pieces together. And you had to choose between taking care of your husband and continuing to watch your son from a distance. Sandra nodded miserably. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Sorry doesn't fix anything. Gideon's composure shattered completely. Sorry doesn't give me back my wedding day with my mother there. Sorry doesn't undo 12 years of believing I wasn't good enough to love. He looked at the crowd of reporters, at the neighbors who'd watched this family destroy itself in real time, at Eleanor whose face was streaked with tears. You want to know why I really came back here today, he said, his voice carrying across the stunned crowd. It wasn't to save you. It wasn't to offer you some noble second chance. I came back here to prove to myself that I didn't need your love anymore. That I could look at the people who broke me and feel nothing. He gestured at the scattered contract pages. But standing here now, listening to you talk about how you protected me by abandoning me, I realize something. I don't feel nothing. I feel everything. And it's killing me. The words hung in the air like a gunshot. Sandra stepped forward, reaching desperately toward her son. Please, baby, please don't give up on us. We can fix this. We can. No. Gideon's voice was final, absolute. We can't. Because you had 12 years to fix this, and instead you chose to be a tourist in my life rather than a participant. He turned to Eleanor, his face a mask of devastation. Let's go. This was a mistake. Gideon, wait, Raymond called out, but his son was already walking toward the Bentley. As Gideon reached the car, he turned back one final time to look at his parents. Sandra collapsed on the front porch, sobbing into her hands, Raymond standing helplessly beside her, both of them surrounded by the wreckage of their choices. Do you think a family can survive this level of betrayal and broken trust? Is there any way back from this kind of devastating revelation? The offer is withdrawn, he announced to the cameras, his voice hollow. The foreclosure will proceed as scheduled. As the Bentley pulled away from the curb, leaving his parents to face the consequences of their choices alone, it seemed like the Thompson family's story had finally reached its tragic conclusion. But sometimes the darkest hour comes just before the dawn. The Bentley had barely made it 3 blocks when Eleanor's calm voice cut through the silence like a lifeline. Pull over. Gideon's hands were shaking so badly he could barely grip the steering wheel. What? I said pull over. Right now. Her tone brooked no argument, the same voice she'd used when he was 18 and trying to drop out of college because he was convinced he wasn't smart enough. Gideon pulled into the parking lot of a defunct gas station, his chest heaving with barely controlled emotion. This isn't over, Eleanor said firmly. Yes, it is. Gideon slammed his palm against the steering wheel. Did you hear what she said back there? She's been watching me for 12 years like I was some kind of entertainment. Like my life was a TV show she could tune into whenever she felt guilty enough. Eleanor turned in her seat to face him fully, her silver hair catching the late afternoon light streaming through the windshield. Baby, I need to tell you something. Something I should have told you years ago. The tone in her voice made Gideon's blood run cold. What? I knew she was watching you. The words hit him like a physical blow. What did you say? Eleanor's composure, the The same unshakable calm that had anchored him through every crisis for over a decade, finally cracked. I knew your mother was there. At your graduation, at the award ceremonies, sitting in her car outside my house. I knew, and I never told you. Gideon stared at the woman who'd been his salvation, feeling the ground shift beneath him once again. You knew. For the first few years, I thought she might eventually work up the courage to approach you directly. So I waited. I watched her watching you, and I hoped that maternal love would eventually overcome whatever fear was keeping her away. And when it didn't? Eleanor's voice broke slightly. When it didn't, I made a choice. I decided that protecting your healing was more important than forcing a confrontation that might destroy the progress you were making. Gideon felt like he was drowning all over again. So everyone was lying to me. Everyone was keeping secrets about my own life. No, baby. We were protecting you from people who weren't ready to love you the way you deserved. Eleanor reached for his hands, her touch gentle but insistent. There's a difference. Is there? Gideon's voice was raw with pain. Because from where I'm sitting, it feels like everyone decided what was best for me without actually asking me what I wanted. Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the abandoned gas station where weeds grew through cracks in the concrete. Finally, she spoke. What did you want, baby? Really? The question hit him like a revelation. For 12 years, he'd told himself he wanted nothing from his parents. He'd built an empire, found love, created a family with Eleanor and David. He'd convinced himself he was complete without the people who'd rejected him. I wanted them to fight for me, he whispered, the truth emerging like a confession. I wanted them to love me more than they loved their reputation. I wanted them to choose me. And when your mother told you she'd been watching you all these years, what did you hear? Gideon closed his eyes, replaying the scene on his parents' front porch. I heard that she was too ashamed of me to love me publicly. What if that's not what happened? Eleanor's phone buzzed with a text message. She glanced at it, and her expression shifted to something Gideon had never seen before, hope mixed with urgency. What is it? It's from my friend Sarah at Children's Healthcare, Eleanor said, her voice growing stronger. She's been researching something for me ever since I told her we were coming here today. She showed him the text, found the records you asked about. Sandra Thompson made 47 donations to the hospital over 12 years. Always anonymous. Always on Gideon's birthday. Amounts got bigger as his company grew. Last donation was $50,000 2 months ago, right after Raymond's heart attack. Gideon stared at the phone, his world tilting once again. She was donating money to the hospital where you found me? Every year, Eleanor confirmed. And look at this. She scrolled to another message, also found this in our files. Sandra Thompson called our LGBTQ+ support group coordinator 73 times over the past decade. Never gave her name, but the caller ID matched. She'd ask about resources for families of gay youth, then hang up when asked for contact information. The pieces began falling into place with devastating clarity. His mother hadn't just been watching him. She'd been trying to educate herself, trying to understand, trying to find ways to help other families avoid the mistakes she'd made. There's more, Eleanor said softly, pulling up a final message. She funded 3 full college scholarships for homeless LGBTQ+ youth through our foundation. Anonymous donors, but the checks came from her bank. She specifically requested they go to kids who'd been rejected by religious families. Gideon felt his carefully constructed anger beginning to crumble. She was trying to save other kids. She was trying to do what she couldn't do for you, Eleanor confirmed. Not because she didn't love you, but because she loved you so much it broke her when she realized what she'd done. A car door slammed in the distance, and Gideon looked up to see a familiar figure walking across the parking lot. David, his husband of 18 months, approached the car with a measured stride of someone who'd received an urgent phone call and dropped everything to be there. "Your assistant called me," David said as he reached the driver's side window. "Said you might need backup." Gideon had never been so grateful to see another human being in his life. David's presence grounded him, reminded him of who he'd become and what he'd built despite his parents' rejection. "I don't know what to do," Gideon admitted, his voice breaking. "Everything I thought I knew about them, about why they hurt me, it's all more complicated than I thought." David knelt beside the car door, his dark eyes filled with the same compassionate intelligence that had made Gideon fall in love with him in the first place. "What does your heart tell you?" "My heart is terrified," Gideon replied honestly. "My heart wants to believe they can change, but my head knows that wanting something doesn't make it true." "Then maybe," David said gently, "this isn't about what they can become. Maybe this is about who you already are." Eleanor leaned forward from the passenger seat. "What do you mean?" "I mean that the man I married didn't build a foundation to help LGBTQ+ youth because he was angry," David explained. "He built it because he was compassionate. Because even when he was hurting, he couldn't stand the thought of other kids going through what he went through." Gideon looked back toward the direction of his childhood home, where his parents were probably still sitting in the wreckage of their public humiliation. "You know what the real tragedy would be," David continued. "If the same fear that kept your mother from approaching you for 12 years keeps you from giving them the chance to prove they can do better. Do you think Gideon should give his parents another chance? Can love overcome years of pain and missed opportunities?" Eleanor's phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. She glanced at the caller ID and frowned. "It's Sandra." The three of them stared at the phone as it rang once, twice, 3 times. "Answer it," Gideon said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Eleanor accepted the call and put it on speaker. Sandra's voice came through, raw and broken but determined. "Mrs. Whitfield, I know my son probably never wants to see me again, but I have something to tell him. Something that might change everything." As Sandra's voice filled the car, Gideon realized they were about to learn the truth that would either destroy his family forever or finally set them all free. The moment of truth had arrived. Sandra's voice trembled through the car's speakers, each word heavy with years of suppressed truth. "Gideon, the night we threw you out, it wasn't just about you being gay." The parking lot fell silent except for the distant hum of traffic. Even David, who'd never heard the full story, leaned closer to the phone. "What do you mean?" Gideon's voice was barely audible. "That morning, before you came home to tell us about Marcus, about the boy you loved, Pastor Williams and 3 deacons from our church showed up at our front door." Eleanor's eyes widened. She'd suspected church pressure, but this sounded more serious. "They had photographs," Sandra continued, her voice breaking. "Pictures of you and Marcus holding hands outside that coffee shop in Atlanta. Someone from the congregation had seen you and followed you around for weeks, documenting everything." Gideon's blood ran cold. He remembered Marcus, his first love, his first real relationship. They'd been so careful, or so they'd thought. "Pastor Williams gave us an ultimatum," Sandra pressed on. "Either we correct you immediately and publicly denounce your lifestyle, or they would not only excommunicate our entire family, but they would also ensure your father lost his job at the church-run community center. Raymond's voice came through the background, weak but audible. Son, that job was our only income. Without it, we would have lost everything, the house, our insurance, everything. But that's not all, Sandra said, her voice growing stronger with confession. Pastor Williams told us that if we supported your sin, they would make sure everyone in town knew. Our insurance agent was in that congregation. He would have dropped our coverage. Your father's heart condition meant we couldn't afford to lose our health insurance. David's hand found Gideon's shoulder, squeezing gently as the full picture began to emerge. The bank president was a deacon, Sandra continued. Our mortgage company manager sang in the church choir. The grocery store owner where I worked part-time, all of them were there that Sunday when Pastor Williams announced that any family harboring sexual deviance would be cast out from the Christian community entirely. Eleanor closed her eyes, understanding now the impossible position Gideon's parents had been placed in. So when you came home that evening, Sandra's voice cracked completely, we had a choice to make. Lose our son, or lose literally everything else. Our income, our health care, our home, our entire support system. In a town of 8,000 people where everyone goes to one of 3 churches, being cast out meant social and economic death. You chose them over me, Gideon said, but his voice lacked its earlier venom. We chose survival over love, Sandra replied with devastating honesty. And we've regretted it every single day since. Raymond's voice grew stronger. Son, that doesn't excuse what we did. Nothing excuses what we did. But I need you to understand, we were terrified. Terrified of losing everything, terrified of being destroyed, terrified of not being able to take care of ourselves or each other. The real tragedy, Sandra added, is that we lost everything anyway. The church community abandoned us the moment your father had his heart attack and couldn't work anymore. All those people we thought were our friends, all those people we chose over you, they disappeared the second we needed help. The silence in the car was deafening. This was the reality of small-town America that no one liked to talk about. How economic survival and social acceptance were so intertwined that families were forced to choose between love and literally having a roof over their heads. Mrs. Patterson next door, Sandra continued, she was one of the deacon's wives who pushed us to reject you. Last month, when our electricity was about to be shut off, I went to her for help. You know what she told me. What? Gideon whispered. She said that our financial troubles were God's punishment for raising a sinful child. That if we'd done our job right as Christian parents, you never would have turned out gay. David's face contorted with anger. She blamed you for his sexuality? The whole church did, Raymond's voice came through. They said we must have failed as parents, that we were being punished for our own hidden sins. When I had my heart attack, only 2 people from our congregation of 300 visited me in the hospital. But you know who did visit. Sandra's voice grew stronger. Dr. Martinez, the therapist whose name is in your foundation contract. She came to see me 6 months ago when she heard through social services that we were struggling. Eleanor sat up straighter. Dr. Martinez contacted you? She told me that Gideon had been funding anonymous scholarships for kids rejected by religious families. She said he'd specifically requested that some of the money go toward family counseling for parents who wanted to reconcile with their LGBTQ+ children but didn't know how. The revelation hit Gideon like lightning. His foundation work, his way of helping other kids avoid his fate, had inadvertently reached his own parents. She told me about the support groups, the counseling programs, The resources for families learning to choose love over dogma, Sandra continued. And she told me something else. She said that the young man funding all of this work had specifically said he hoped no parent would ever have to choose between their child and their survival the way his parents had. You knew, David said quietly. You knew Gideon was behind the programs. Dr. Martinez never said his name directly, Sandra replied. But when she described a successful businessman who'd been rejected by his religious family in Georgia and was now dedicating his life to helping others, I knew. I knew my son was still trying to save families like ours, even after what we'd done to him. The weight of this revelation settled over everyone in the car. Gideon had been unknowingly working to heal the very wounds his parents had created, while simultaneously creating pathways for other families to avoid making the same devastating choice. The contract you offered us today, Raymond said, his voice growing stronger, working with families going through what we went through, we want to do it. Not because we need the money, though God knows we do, but because maybe we can help other parents understand that choosing economic security over your child's love isn't really choosing security at all. Sandra's voice became fierce with determination. We lost everything anyway, Gideon. Our church family, our community, our financial stability, all of it disappeared the moment we needed support. The only thing we didn't lose was our love for you, and we were too proud and too scared to fight for the only thing that actually mattered. Eleanor looked at Gideon, tears streaming down her face. Baby, what do you want to do? Gideon stared out at the abandoned gas station, thinking about all the families across America facing the same impossible choice his parents had faced. Economic survival versus unconditional love. Social acceptance versus authentic family bonds. The fear of losing everything versus the courage to risk everything for what really mattered. Can you imagine having to choose between your child's happiness and your family's survival? How many American families face this same impossible decision every day? Turn the car around, he said finally, his voice steady for the first time all day. Are you sure? David asked. Gideon looked at his husband, then at Eleanor, the woman who'd shown him what unconditional love looked like, and nodded. I'm sure. It's time to go home and help my parents learn the difference between surviving and living. As they pulled back onto the road toward his childhood home, Gideon realized that sometimes the most revolutionary act isn't rejecting the people who hurt you, it's showing them there's a better way to love. The real healing was about to begin. The Bentley pulled back onto the familiar street to find the media circus still in full swing. But something had changed. Instead of the chaotic feeding frenzy from before, the reporters had organized themselves into a more respectful perimeter. Some were interviewing neighbors, others were setting up for what looked like a more formal press conference. Looks like the story got bigger while we were gone, David observed as they approached the house. Gideon could see his parents still on the front porch, but they weren't alone anymore. Dr. Martinez, the family therapist from his foundation, was sitting between Sandra and Raymond, her calm presence seeming to anchor them both. As the Bentley parked, she looked up and gave Gideon a small, knowing smile. How did she get here so fast? Eleanor wondered aloud. I called her while we were talking, David admitted. Figured if we were going to do this, we might need professional backup. As they approached the house, Gideon could see that his parents had changed. Not physically, they looked just as worn and beaten down as they had an hour ago. But something in their posture, in the way they held themselves, was different. They looked like people who had finally stopped running from the truth. Dr. Martinez, Eleanor greeted warmly as they reached the porch. Thank you for coming. Eleanor, it's good to see you again. Dr. Martinez stood and extended her hand to Gideon. "And you must be the young man I've heard so much about. Your parents have been telling me about the conversation you just had." Gideon looked at his mother and father, these two broken people who had somehow found the courage to lay their souls bare in front of a therapist they'd never met before. "And?" he asked cautiously. "And I think," Dr. Martinez said with the careful precision of someone who'd spent decades helping families navigate impossible situations, "that this family is finally ready to have the conversation they should have had 12 years ago." Sandra stood up slowly, her eyes never leaving her son's face. "Gideon, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." "Okay." "That night we threw you out. If we had chosen differently, if we had lost everything but kept you, would you have stayed? Would you have helped us figure out how to rebuild our lives together?" The question hung in the air like a bridge between past and present. Gideon looked at this woman who had given birth to him, raised him, loved him, and then broken his heart so completely he'd nearly died from it. "Yes," he said simply. "I would have stayed. I would have worked 3 jobs to help pay the bills. I would have faced down Pastor Williams and every deacon in that church. I would have done anything to keep our family together." Sandra's face crumpled, but this time her tears weren't just grief. They carried relief, and something that looked like hope. "Then we made the wrong choice," she whispered. "And we've been paying for it every day since." Raymond stepped forward, his weathered hand shaking as he pulled something from his pocket, a folded piece of paper that looked like it had been handled thousands of times. "What's that?" Gideon asked. "It's the speech I wrote for your high school graduation," his father said, his voice thick with emotion. "The one I never got to give because we weren't there. I've been carrying it around for 12 years, rewriting it every time you accomplished something new." He unfolded the paper with reverent care. "It says, 'My son Gideon is the bravest person I've ever known. He had the courage to tell his truth even when he knew it might cost him everything. He chose authenticity over safety, love over fear. I failed him when he needed me most, but he succeeded anyway. And that success is a testimony to who he really is, not who I was afraid he might become." The words hit Gideon like a physical force. Around them, the reporters had gone completely silent, understanding they were witnessing something sacred. "You wrote that 12 years ago?" "I've been rewriting it for 12 years, Raymond clarified. "Every time you won an award, every time your company grew, every time I saw you on the news helping other kids, I added to it. This version is from last week, after I read about your marriage to David." David stepped closer, his hand finding Gideon's. "What does it say about that?" Raymond's voice grew stronger as he read. "It says that my son found someone who loves him completely, the way I should have loved him from the beginning. Someone who sees his heart and honors it. Someone who makes him laugh and supports his dreams and builds a life with him based on respect and joy and partnership. It says that I am proud of the man he became, and I am sorry I wasn't there to celebrate the journey." The silence that followed was profound. Even the news cameras seemed to respect the gravity of the moment. "There's more," Sandra said softly, pulling out her own folded paper. "This is what I was going to say at your wedding. The toast I never got to give." She cleared her throat, her voice growing steadier with each word. "To my son Gideon and his husband David, may your love be everything mine wasn't. May it be brave when the world asks you to hide. May it be strong when others try to break it. May it be patient when families fail you and joyful when you build new ones. And may it always remember that true love isn't about who accepts you, it's about accepting yourself so completely that rejection can never destroy you." Eleanor wiped tears from her eyes. "Sandra, that's beautiful." "I've been practicing it for 18 months, Sandra replied. "Ever since I found out about the wedding from the newspaper announcement. I kept hoping that maybe someday I'd get the chance to say it to him directly." Dr. Martinez stepped forward gently. "Gideon, how are you feeling right now?" The question forced him to take inventory of his emotional state. The rage was still there, but it was tempered now by something else, understanding maybe, or the beginning of forgiveness. "I'm feeling like my parents have been living their own version of hell for the past 12 years, he said honestly. "And I'm wondering if continuing to punish them helps anyone heal." "What would help you heal?" Dr. Martinez asked. Gideon looked at the scattered contract pages on the ground, then at his parents, then at the crowd of reporters who were documenting this family's most vulnerable moment for the world to see. "I want to modify the contract," he said finally. Sandra's eyes widened with hope. "You'll give us another chance?" "I'll give us all another chance," Gideon corrected. "But with changes. The 12-month commitment stays. The work with LGBTQ+ families stays. But we add family therapy, weekly sessions for all of us, including Eleanor and David. Because this isn't just about you learning to help other families. It's about us learning to be a family again." Raymond nodded eagerly. "Whatever you need. Whatever it takes." "And one more thing," Gideon added, his voice growing stronger. "No more secrets. No more watching from a distance. No more anonymous donations or hidden support. If we're going to do this, we do it openly, honestly, together. All of us." Eleanor picked up the scattered contract pages from the sidewalk, smoothing them out carefully. "I think we can make those modifications work." A reporter called out from the crowd. "Mr. Thompson, what message do you want to send to other families dealing with similar situations?" Gideon looked at his parents, at his chosen family, at the community of media and neighbors who had witnessed their breakdown and were now witnessing their tentative first steps toward healing. "The message is that love isn't always enough," he said clearly. "But it's always necessary. My parents loved me, but they let fear override that love. I loved them, but I let hurt override that love. Real family isn't just about emotion, it's about choice. Every day you have to choose to show up, choose to do the work, choose to believe that people can change and grow and become better than they were." He looked directly at his mother and father. "We're all choosing to try. That doesn't erase the past, but maybe it can create a different future." Sandra stepped forward, her hand extended tentatively toward her son. Can I hug you?" For 12 years, Gideon had imagined this moment. Sometimes he'd fantasized about rejecting her the way she'd rejected him. Sometimes he dreamed of falling into her arms and pretending none of the pain had ever happened. The reality was more complex than either fantasy. When he stepped into his mother's embrace, he felt everything at once: the love that had never really died, the hurt that would take time to heal, the hope that maybe they could build something new from the ruins of what they'd lost. What do you think it takes for a family to truly heal from years of pain and separation? Can love really overcome fear when people are willing to do the hard work? "We have a lot of work to do," he whispered into her hair. "We have the rest of our lives to do it," she whispered back. As the cameras rolled and the world watched, the Thompson family took their first tentative steps toward becoming whole again. It wouldn't be easy. There would be setbacks, difficult conversations, moments when old wounds reopened and trust felt impossible. But they were choosing to try. And sometimes, Choosing to try is the most courageous thing a family can do. The real work was just beginning, but for the first time in 12 years, they were ready to do it together. As the sun set over the small town that had once driven them apart, Gideon Thompson stood on his childhood porch surrounded by every form of family he'd ever known. The parents who'd failed him, the woman who'd saved him, the man who'd chosen him, and a community of people who were witnessing their commitment to healing. It wasn't the ending anyone had expected, but it was the beginning they all needed. The story wasn't over. In many ways, the most important chapter was just starting. Thank you for following this emotional journey. What did this story teach you about the power of love, forgiveness, and second chances in your own family relationships? Thank you so much for watching this story all the way to the end. If this touched your heart, then you're going to love the next one. It's just as powerful, and even more intriguing than you can imagine. So don't stop here. Check out more videos on my channel and continue the journey. I'll be waiting for you on the other side of that story. See you there.